Welcome to my senior project presentation that I did for my Bachelors of Science degree in music. This presentation was put together with the intent to create a condensed insight into the last 150 years of drumming history. All the materials in this presentation are for educational purposes only, with no intent to monetize or privatize in any way, shape, or form. I pooled a lot of resources through various channels, and specifically, I would like to acknowledge the following for insight, information, media, and recordings that I used to put this presentation together. Daniel Glass with Century Project and Traps, The Incredible Story of Vintage Drums. Not So Modern Drummer, drumarchive.com, Getty Images, the Percussive Arts Society International Headquarters and Museum, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada Regimental Museum in Casa Loma, Toronto, Century Drum Shop, Brandon Snyder of Balance Productions, and lastly, Dr. James A. Strain at Northern Michigan University. Without you, none of this would have been possible. I highly recommend that if you are at all interested in more in-depth coverage of any of the topics covered in this presentation, that you seek out these resources as I did and enjoy the plethora of drum history that awaits. Thanks for the support and enjoy.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Strain, and as part of Nolan's music degree, there's an option of either doing a senior recital or doing some kind of a senior project. And he's decided to do a senior project, and we've been working for quite a while just going through something that he's really interested in, which is sort of the history of drums and the development of drums and all of that. And it manifests itself by what essentially is a wholly American creation, which is the drum set. It begins in the United States pretty much, and it is developed there. It pretty quickly crosses over to England and parts of Europe and everything, but the initial development of it starts with the initiation of jazz and the whole process of that sort of stuff. And he's got an excellent program here, and I am going to say that at some certain time when we're done, don't hesitate to ask questions and get up and walk around and look at all the drum sets. And I think we're going historically that way. All right.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. So my presentation today is about the history of drum set. I'm really excited to see so many different kinds of people show up and be as enthusiastic about this subject as I am. Well, let's dive right into it. Today you go on Google, Amazon, go to your music store, and you ask for a drum set. This is kind of the thing that you expect to see. You have a snare drum, and you have some drums here called toms. You have a couple cymbals, a whole bunch of hardware, but the question is, where did this come from? This wasn't just some kind of spontaneous contraption that popped up out of nowhere. What most people don't realize is that drum kit in itself took a very long time to develop, and like Dr. Strain said, it is a wholly American instrument. And like everything American, it has a backstory. So when we're starting our story, it starts with the American Civil War. So during this time, we had marching bands, and they would play in formation, 2 or 3 men, playing either a bass drum, a snare drum, or a cymbal. And that can be seen on this old photograph here. Now what you would have 100 men to accompany, and all of these men would march in unison. And usually what they played was something referred to as rudimental drumming. And that would be a set pattern of drumming, and then they would all march in unison to keep the beat of the men. So as we move in from the late 1800s into the 20th century, the majority of drums actually looked like this. This is a picture I took at Casa Loma in Toronto in the Military Museum. Here we see something called a rope tension drum, where you have 2 hoops holding usually an animal skin, such as calf, down and tensioning it against the wood shell of the drum. And as you can see here, the men would march in some kind of formation just like this. So at the turn of the century, we're talking 1890s to 1900, we come across this gentleman, John Philip Sousa, who was a very, very famous composer at this time. He made very many marching compositions, and he was wildly popular across the United States. Matter of fact, he traveled from coast to coast, from major city to major city, playing marching tunes very much like you heard just now, except with an expanded array of instruments. Everything from brass, big drums, snare drums, you name it. It was just a fantastic show. So most people in small towns couldn't afford a massive band. They didn't have the resources of, say, 2 or 3 or 4 people with enough free time and who would work for free to play these kinds of pieces and this kind of music. So the economical way that you would play music, usually in your small town, in your church, or maybe your music hall, would be to do something called double drumming. And that is taking the roles of 3 separate guys and smushing them into one. At this point in time, you have your snare drum here, and usually what would happen is you'd have a bass drum on the floor, very much like this setup right here. There was no such thing as a snare drum stand. There was no such thing as a drum pedal. You would have maybe somebody either standing or sitting down with their drumsticks, and they would stand right behind the drum kit, just like this, and playing each simultaneously. This was a really good way to keep costs down, and maybe once in a while they might find some kind of cymbal and hook it onto the bass drum. So people were very frustrated at this fact that, hey, I can't really reach that bass drum with my hands. It's kind of a tedious way to play things. So that's where we come into ideas of playing it with your foot, also known as a drum pedal. And there are examples of as soon as 1840 where this kind of design shows up in smaller bands called an overhang pedal, which is essentially a pendulum being held down on a metal rod, and you put your foot down here with either string or wire, and it would cause this pendulum to hit your bass drum. Now, a lot of drummers didn't actually like this setup because it was so clumsy and tedious. It required a lot of effort to play, and it wasn't very precise. So as we move into the 20th century, we see more and more people trying to perfect some kind of design where they can reduce the amount of parts, they can reduce the amount of effort that's going into this. And eventually, in 1909, very similar to this pedal here, we have a sort of perfected mechanism. And little close-ups here that I took at a drum museum in Toronto as well, you can see the intricacy of the design here. But really, no matter what the company was, it was essentially the same thing. You had a footboard, a post, and what you would call the beater part here, usually made of lamb's wool. And sometimes they would also fasten another extra piece of metal here so that you could hit the cymbal at the same time while you were playing. All of these things combined happened really at the same time as many different things in US history. And I'd like to talk about Congo Square. Now, Congo Square is a congregation place in Louisiana. It could be known as the birthplace of jazz, also the birthplace of many types of music, such as blues. We kind of have a nod towards Congo Square because Louisiana, unlike a lot of southern states at the time, a lot of the slaves were not allowed to celebrate their culture. They were not allowed to keep their African name. They were not allowed to play drums. And they certainly weren't allowed to sing or speak in their African language. So in Louisiana, this was one of the exceptions. On Sundays, after the slaves had finished their work and gone to church, they had the day off. And typically what they would do is congregate in Congo Square. And here they would speak their language. They would talk to each other. They would play the music that they had grown up with and knew about and listened to their whole lives. This is a really important place in drum set history because when white people started going to Congo Square and listening to these rhythms, they were very, very unlike the traditional rhythms of the day. At the same time as all of this in Congo Square was going on, we had immigration going on from everything from the 1860s beyond. There was an influx of people from all corners of the world looking to find a better lives for themselves in America. When these immigrants came here, they usually brought their music and they brought their cymbals and they brought their traditional instruments with them. So in Turkey, the Zildjian cymbal company it's one of the oldest cymbal companies in the world. As a matter of fact, it was established around about 1600. Very, very old. They had been using cymbals for years, both ceremoniously, in a military setting, and musically. People from Asia, they had temple blocks that they would use in the temple. In China, these small drums here of calf skins or goat skin tagged to a wood shell known as a tom-tom. People would bring these with them. And down here is an example of what we would call Greco cymbals. Greco, from Greece. They're small cymbals that would clip to the sides of drums. Now, drummers love to experiment. And of course, the more these kinds of things proliferated society, the more people wanted to play music with them. And so when we start to see the drummer kind of step beyond just a bass drum and a snare drum, they wanted to bring these things with them, and they wanted to play with them. And that meant that you had an interesting sound. That usually meant that you could play more bands and make more money. At the same time, we see public transportation start to crop up in all of the US major cities. In order to bring that kind of stuff with you, there was a law on the tram that you could only bring onto the tram what you could carry. And so you started to see drummers carry their bass drum, find ways to open it up and pull all of their things inside of it so that they could bring it with them. Now, a really, really important advent, ragtime. This came from listeners of Congo Square, starting to get that syncopated feel, kind of like an It was this new kind of thinking of rhythm that these musicians wanted to implement and they wanted to play. So very many famous drummers at the time, such as James Lent, utilizing these aspects of instruments from immigrants, started to play with them in a new kind of way with syncopated rhythm. And so here's an example of James Lent playing what is known as the ragtime snare drumming. Right now, I hope. There we are. So try to think about these new instruments that are popping up. There's woodblock for the first time. There's this kind of syncopated rhythm going on. It's not quite as straightforward. It's not so clear cut. It's not so empirical in its construction. Everything kind of swings a little bit more. And as you can see on the drum set here, we're starting to kind of get a little bit more experimentation. So ragtime was a really, really popular music form in the turn of the century. And eventually it led to the formation of jazz later on. But a big event that happened in 1917 was America's involvement in the First World War. Now, why is this important? This is important because with military men going overseas, officers, enlisted men, they usually brought records with them. And fortunately for them, the gramophone had been around so long, it had started to become so affordable that certain lucky members of society could bring this with them. And when troops came into France and fought on the Western Frontier, they could use their spare time to listen to these records. French, English, and other European forces listened to these as well, spreading the influence of American music. And one of the most prolific of those bands at the time, 1917, was the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Now, funny story about the word jazz. The original Dixieland Jazz Band wasn't called the Jazz Band, it was called the Jazz Band with 2 S's. Now, there's a lot of conjecture with where the word jazz comes from. Some say it's an expression to jazz things up, to make it more interesting. Others say there has some kind of deeper root or meaning. But suffice to say, they abruptly changed the spelling of jazz. And one theory is because typically playing late at night in large cities, you have somebody stumbling down the road, looking at the sign, and with one piece of graffiti, makes a very tasteful edit to that name. So they kept it a jazz band. So this is a very important piece of music here from Tony Sabero called the Jixie Jazz Band One Step. It's one of the very first recordings of jazz on record. And you can kind of hear how things have developed more of a... Things are more swung. They're not so much cut and rigid. It's not so uptight that ragtime was. It's taking these small pieces of African culture, implementing them into a drum set. And you can see in this photograph here how now it's becoming more and more common that these different instruments are getting on top of your drum set. One of the reasons, though, that we don't hear drums a lot on early records is because of the process of recording at the time. Usually what they would say is we're laying down the wax. That is because records were literally made of wax. And you can kind of see here, this would be what you would refer to as a studio back then. You have your quieter instruments, violins, you maybe have some brass back here, your louder instruments kind of towards the back of the room, but at the very, very, very back you have your drum player. That was because studio engineers at the time, they were very, very scared that if somebody hit their bass drum loud enough, the needle imprinting the music onto the wax blank would skip, and you would just get hacks in your music. So for a long time, drums aren't that prominent on records, and if they are, they had to be heavily muffled and played very, very quietly. So then we move in from after World War I into the 20s. This is where jobs for drummers explode. This is a really interesting era, both in terms of music, film, culture, and art. Because all of a sudden, you're not just playing in your local band anymore. You had silent film. You had variety shows where people could come and pay a nickel, and they could sit down and they could witness essentially what is an all-day talent show. You have theater productions, because this is a time before there were recorded music synchronized with what was on screen. So as you can see in this picture here, right there you have your drummer, you have a piano player, and looks like a little violinist over here. So they would have to make the music on the fly. And also, this applied to radio. Now, this is Roy C. Knapp's Traps drum kit. And what does Traps mean? Well, when they started talking about drum sets in general, putting things on, okay, I thought it was a simple drum set. I thought it was just a bass drum and a snare drum and that was it, right? Well, when we move along 20 years down the road, we start to see all kinds of things. We start to see more cymbals, more toms, cowbells, wood blocks. Well, they started referring to these drum sets as contraptions, so shortened traps. This was a very famous radio drummer's drum set way back in the day, in about 1920. And he would have to improvise live sound effects and live music to whatever was playing on the radio at the time. I thought it was interesting when I did my research that I was looking through old Ludwig catalogs, and we saw that there were all kinds of sound effects popping up. We have a slapstick, maybe a lion or bear imitator. Those aren't so unusual nowadays. But then I started to get onto the pages of endless bird calls. There's duck quacks, duck call, cyclone wind whistle. Of course, no drummer can afford to be without a reliable wind whistle. I thought that was interesting. But this is my favorite, the hit of the season, the slide whistle. Absolutely essential. And the way that they talked about these things, I mean, they really tried to sell you, I'll tell you what. So we're moving on to another era in the 20s. This is the golden age. It's economic prosperity, relatively speaking. You also had this kind of evangelicalism in government that wanted to do away with alcohol. It called Prohibition. Now, people didn't like that. That was a vastly unpopular, very unpopular policy. People still wanted to get drinks, and you can't be drinking without music. So at this time, you could go into any speakeasy and you would always have a band. That meant job security for drummers. And of course, there was a risque attitude. There was this kind of forbidden fruit aspect to it. So the more forbidden it was, the more dangerous it was, the more popular it became. And one of the music styles that suited this to the teeth was jazz. And how jazz evolved is how it kind of shows you that with Zutty Singleton here with the King Porter Stomp. Now this is 10 years later from the original Dixieland Jazz Band. The first thing that you notice is how danceable this is. It just makes you want to move. It loosens you up. You can imagine all of these people dancing. And that in part has to do with the Chicago style of drumming. And that involves what you would know as 4 on the floor. This whole dum 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 with your foot. It's a quarter note bass drum pulse all the time. Very easy to dance to. Drum sets were getting bigger. Cymbals were getting louder. People wanted to dance. And by golly, jazz, it really fit the bill. We go ahead about 10 more years and we have this gentleman. Anyone know who this is? This is Gene Krupa. Very, very, very famous drummer. He was the cat's meow. He was the bee's knees. He was what everyone was talking about. But what a lot of people don't know, other than being a famous jazz musician, is that he really helped advance drum set technology. Now this is a picture of how tom-toms used to be. This is a Wahlberg and Auger drum set. It was fixed like this, but thanks to Gene Krupa, we went away from this whole design and into a more adjustable tension on both sides of the drum. Unlike the previous generations where we had tom-toms that were tacked on, he advocated for adjustable drum heads on either side of the drum. This meant more tunability and better playability. And you can hear that more than ever in his 1937 Sing, Sing, Sing. And it starts right on the floor tom here, featuring it for the very first time. Anyone recognize this one? Yeah. So we start to get sassier, more dissonance. You start to get more color than there ever has been before. This was the era of big bands. This is the first time that they started getting people together in large groups to play music together. And it would be the style of music that would dominate the American landscape for the next 15 years. Because of the Great Depression, it became very cheap to travel. Ergo, you could afford to get more people, and therefore, it was a lot easier to get big bands together. I also like to take one moment to talk about certain technologies at the time that really were a hindrance to drums. And you'll be probably wondering why, of all things, we have a light inside the bass drum here, also in this bass drum over here. Calfskin, as an organic material, reacts to moisture and heat. And so what that meant was that it was a real pain in the butt when you had to tune things. Because as a drummer, you could start out in an empty club and it was a mild, balmy 60 degrees. By the time you had 100 people in there, it had gone up to 80 degrees. And everyone was sweating, everyone was breathing. It got hot and moist, and so your drums would slowly become looser and looser to the point you had to stop playing and retune them. So the light bulb was meant to counteract that somewhat in order to dry out that skin, so kind of to prolong the tuning a little bit more. So, what was the technological response to this? In 1956, Chick Evans was the one to create the world's very first weatherproof synthetic drumhead, and shortly after him in 1957, Remo Belli creates the Mylar drumhead that's weatherproof, hence the name Weather King. Also, you probably noticed that we heard hi-hat for the first time. What is a hi-hat? So people were first experimenting with cymbals, really like that chick sound to keep a pulse, especially in the early 20s, going on to the 30s. But people weren't really sure exactly how to play that. The very first design that they came up with was known as a snowshoe pedal. In essence, it was just kind of like a spring and two pieces of wood, and you could kind of keep time with it on your foot while you sat down and played the rest of the kit. They experimented with different kinds, including this handheld version here, known as a hand sock cymbal. So you would just play it with your hands with the stick. And eventually somebody came up with the idea of, well, maybe instead of having a bulky design like this, let's try do it with a spring here. And then the rest is history, because once somebody figured out that it was way more fun to bring it off the floor and play it with your sticks, it caught on and it stayed. We go through this era of big bands right through World War II. And finally, war is over in 1945. There's this economic boom that dragged America right out of the Depression. There's no more uncertainty as to job security because so many people had jobs now and money. And for the first time, women were working factories. African Americans were working. People had money to spend. So this was a complete turnaround from what the previous 30 years had all been about. People wanted to move on from this whole era of wartime, suffering, economic hardship, rationing. They wanted something new. So these factors together, coupled with the fact that it was much more expensive now to get people together and to travel, big bands kind of died out. People started to shrink their bands again. So one of the ways that they did that was to bring in a few people and shrink the drums down in size, because all of a sudden they couldn't really play as loud as they did before. They got few people together into a small knit group. And one of the responses to the end of World War II was this form of music known as bebop. These were musicians who were sick and tired of swing music. They were sick and tired of just this swung kind of feel, jazz music. They wanted to play something complex, something more elite. So this is an example of clacked overseds tenor. And this is completely different from swing music at the time. All of a sudden, we have more complex, more intricate music going on than ever before. And for the first time there, you hear a ride cymbal. A major development in bebop in that people wanted to get away from the hi-hat cymbal as a timekeeper and wanted to play or were looking for a cymbal that was big and washy that they could also get some nice kind of different sounds off of. And bebop really helped popularize that whole notion of ride cymbals. You can also see these photographs approximately 20 years apart, how big drum sets with relatively small cymbals were shrinking to small drum sets with big cymbals. So we start to see this kind of transition from this big honkin' drum set to a more compact, kind of like the diet version of a drum kit. It was faster to play around it. It was more agile, and people wanted more intricate music to play. As we roll on into the 50s, we had the advent of television, and this changed everything, because with television and with cheaper records and record companies meant widespread proliferation of music of every sort. Here you even see a record party around about 1950. There was dance moves that became more provocative, more reminiscent of something 20, 30 years ago when it was really wild. So we have a whole new generation of people feeding off of the success of World War II, who had children now who were growing up during this time, who could finally afford to buy music. They could afford to buy records. They had allowance. The children didn't have to go out of school to work, which was completely different from what their parents had to go through. And so record companies, they wanted to sell music to these children, and they wanted to exploit some of that money. So they came up with the concept of teeny bopper bands, simple melodies, talking about themes like love and breakup and hardship, and it was danceable music. And we see the explosion of other types of music that gained popularity, because even though we had people who played bebop, like Max Roach and Kenny Clark, most of the people still kind of wanted swing music, but they didn't want to go back in time. So we see an explosion of African American music once again, with R&B and blues, and another genre of music called rockabilly, reminiscent of Elvis Presley, of all of these artists back in way back when, who had more of a driven type of music. Also, we had the advent of electric guitar, electric bass. And no doubt everyone knows who these guys are. 4 young gentlemen from Liverpool. Yes, in 1963, this was a hit music from the Beatles called Please Please Me. Really, they saw their huge debut on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. So, for the first time, we're combining these concepts of hard-hitting, rapid-fire music, electric instruments, and hard-hitting drums. And it was wildly, wildly successful. It was wildly popular. It could be debated that it's continued right into this day, this whole 4-piece, hard-hitting, loud music. And it was made even more popular by the concept of teenage girls. Now, we're seeing this kind of convergence onto this type of drum set here. And this is by far the most popular drum set ever made, a Ludwig Super Classic in a black oyster pearl finish. And it's reminiscent of this drum set here, just slightly different in that the pearl was futuristic, it was modern looking, but because of the Ed Sullivan Show and the popularity of the Beatles, the drummer all of a sudden it was the must-go-to instrument to buy. People wanted to learn, people wanted to go. So we're continuing from the 60s onward, and we have all of these world events going on. It's the Cold War, it's the sex revolution, it's the war in Vietnam, it's freedom of expression, very volatile time, Cuban Missile Crisis. All of a sudden, people start using their music to get the message out, to start spreading a message of love and tolerance and peace and acceptance. And as we go into this era, one of my favorite quotes is, "Bigger is better, less is not more is more." Carl Palmer with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as they gained popularity from the 60s into the 70s. Like I said, we have the Vietnam War. We have Woodstock, which is a very, very important event in time. We have all of these bands getting together. We have Carlos Santana bringing Latin music back and starting the proliferation of Latin music now in popular music as well. We have music on television. We have heavier, more psychedelic, more free-flowing music. Drum sets become larger and louder. And with the advance in microphones and recording technology, now suddenly we can accommodate huge bands like Led Zeppelin and the drummer John Bonham in this very iconic hit, Moby Dick. For the first time, we're starting to see the return of huge, grotesque drums. And it's more obvious than anything else in this song right here. So we're starting to hear everything's getting louder. Everything's getting more distorted. Everything is large. Everything is live. Everything is starting to become more punch in the face, more driven by raw emotion. And it draws huge crowds from all over the world. We're starting to see drum manufacturers themselves move in focus from a 3-ply drum set, which is a thinner drum shell of mahogany and poplar, which are very, very soft woods, to thick drum shells, more reminiscent of what we have today, of either maple or birch or beech, or maybe even making drum shells out of metals such as aluminum or steel or copper. The idea was that louder was better no matter what the circumstance. And with the advancements of heavier drums came more sophisticated drum hardware, as we see this kind of turnaround in research, trying to figure out how are we going to make these easier to play, how are we going to get these to come closer together so that we can play louder, heavier, harder, and rock on until the drum set falls apart. So we see all these changes happening simultaneously, and it continues right through the 70s into the 80s, where we start to see a little bit more of a paradigm shift in terms of the heavy music getting heavier, and also an alternative cropping up, especially in Germany during the Cold War, with electronic music. And here we see two ends of the spectrum around about 1982. On one side, we have a grotesquely large drum set, and on the other side here, we start to see electronic pads be implemented in drum set playing. We have the development of something called the compute rhythm and the Linn drum, which were responsible for all of the hits in pop music from the 1980s. All of these bands coming together and saying, you know what, maybe we want to shift our focus from a drum set player to something that can be programmed and something that can be played and something that's consistent. So we have that branch at the same time as different musicians trying to figure out what's the best way to play music, what's the best way to get as many drums as possible. And we move on to something kind of like this drum set here, where we have multiple cymbals, we have multiple elements of both deep tom sizes, sometimes without the bottom heads, called concert toms, in order to deliver a very hard-hitting, loud drum. So we start to see in 1982 the return of double bass drumming. And this was a concept that had been done before, but never to this extent. And nothing outlines better in my mind, excess and more is more, than Alex Van Halen in the 1980s. So we're going to hear, first of all, double bass drums. Cymbals are brighter, cymbals are louder, cymbals are thicker. And we have the electric guitar coming in now. A lot of different effects, a lot of processing going on here. And we see this type of music become more and more and more popular as time goes on. And it has this kind of hair metal, glam metal, heavy metal, this almost garden of sound that's going on throughout this whole period. As we come to the end of the 1980s and start into the 1990s, people are starting to get kind of turned off by this now. It's been going on. We have bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Gong, Camel, Motorhead, AC/DC, all of these huge American bands who are just more or less cranking out louder, heavier, more sexually orientated music and more rebellious, one after the other. Eventually, the new generation of music listeners kind of wanted to ebb away from that. They didn't like the fact that musicians were selling out, that they were merchandising themselves, that it was more or less more of the same. The Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union imploded on itself. And this opened up the wall between Western East Germany, unifying them again, and also opening the Western world up to Eastern Europe and Russia. So all of a sudden, these unexposed, relatively repressed people are starting to see, for the first time, American music and thinking, does this appeal to me? Electronic music in Europe in particular starts to really catch on. So we have this whole different genre of drumming in a completely different way catching on. At the same time, around about 1990, we have something happening in Seattle, the band is called Nirvana. And we start to see this kind of concept of grunge, of punk, this revival of hard-hitting, raw, very sexually driven music that wasn't overdone, that wasn't dependent upon how many drums you had or how much money that you had. It didn't matter. You didn't have to have a humongous drum set. All you needed was what you had. And that was no more emphasized than It Smells Like Teen Spirit with Dave Grohl and Nirvana. And you can really hear how music it's going away from that overdriven sound and more into this raw, unprocessed, unfiltered concept. And we see no more screaming vocals, we see no more yelled or banshee-like calls going on. It's simple, it's unfiltered, and it appeals to the masses like never before. So we come to the end of the century. We can see how different concepts moving through time have influenced the next, whether that be starting out with basics in a military background, how it moves on to an immigrant melting pot driven drum set, to a more refined as tastes and preferences evolve, to the explosion of power, to today's drum set. What is it? What do we have? The answer is, there is no simple answer. Everything is different. We have entered an age where things are so personalized. There is more choice. The young drummers of today have just a palette of color that they can choose, no matter what they have. But regardless, it's always something of a journey, especially for me going through this whole process of research, to find out where we come from. And by knowing where we come from, maybe we can get newer ideas to create new music as to where we're going. So that wraps up my presentation on the history of drum set. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to say just a couple of acknowledgements. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Strain and his wife, Carrie, for helping me through this process. I think it's just been a fantastic journey. Without you, Dr. Strain, I probably would have fallen out of the program a long time ago, because it was certainly a struggle, and there were many, many times where I personally didn't know if I could continue, and you pushed me and motivated me. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and Carrie as well, on the year that Dr. Strain was on sabbatical. It really means a lot to me. I would also like to thank my lovely wife and the wonderful faculty here at NMU for everything that they did to encourage me to get to where I am today. I want to thank everyone here for showing up. Thank you so much, and your interest is honestly, it fuels me as a drummer. I love to educate, and I love to see people curious about these kinds of things. So thank you so much for showing up. Anyone have any questions? Yes?
Like the hole in the bass drum there.
Okay, so the reason that there's a hole here is and that's actually a really good question for you to ask, is because this kind of shows you the attitudes at the time. This is for a microphone. So when you have a bass drum microphone, it's easier to hear what's going on, especially when there's loud music going on. So back in the day, you really didn't need that so much because music wasn't typically that loud. But it's a really good question. Yeah, it's to facilitate that bass drum microphone so you can really get a good, solid sound. Yes?
I often see the bass drum with a quilt,
Yes?
and I don't think it's just because the drummer's tired. Why?
Yeah, the reason that we have, or the reason I put a pillow in there is also a change in tastes and preferences for music. It's to muffle the drum, to give it a lot more kick. If we compare maybe this bass drum here, this is like a really wide open sounding booming bass drum. With a pillow in it, listen to how this sounds. You see how it's just much more focused. So that's the reason why we have a pillow in there. It works well with the music typically associated with that drum set there. All right, thank you so much. Mm-hmm.